Well, thank you very much. I'm very honoured to be invited. Well, talking about capitalism in a medieval setting immediately makes one reflect on the multiple meanings of that term. Clearly, we need to take care when we apply terminology from the industrial world to a pre-industrial society. Even the term pre-capitalist economic formations, which was used by Eric Hobsbawm as a title for edited extracts from Karl Marx's early work known as the Grundrisse, raises questions for a bourgeois capitalist historian such as myself, who is less certain that we can define the economic relationships that existed in the pre-industrial world by way of their relationship to capitalism, however that term is to be understood, for that's clearly what the term pre-capitalist implies. Still, the Marxist debate about the end of the Middle Ages, or to use the terminology Marxist historians apply, the transition from feudalism to capitalism, is a good place to begin. The debate raises stimulating questions nonetheless, concerned with the nature of town-country relations, with the organization of labor, with the effects of a plague that in the middle of the 14th century is now thought to have carried off half the population of Europe during its first onslaught, the Black Death, and lesser but still very significant numbers as it returned again and again over subsequent decades. Post-war Marxist historians, notably Maurice Dobb, Paul Sweezy and Rodney Hilton, who was the only one with a strong medieval research interest, were keen to find out how well the performance of the Western European economy matched the sequences set out by Karl Marx, and to identify the solvent that transformed the so-called feudal society into capitalist society. But the problem lay in defining what capitalist society was. Changes were certainly taking place in the organization of labor, as wage labor in some but not all areas of Europe encroached more and more on serfdom. In other words, landlords, who in fact had always used some wage labor, placed less reliance on labor services supplied by peasants who held land from them. And serfdom itself was allowed to lapse, or even in some parts of Italy formally abolished, in the case of Bologna and some other towns, well before the Black Death arrived. And we also find that sharecropping arrangements became widespread in some areas. Now, looking at these changes, Sweezy recoiled from the argument that the end of the Middle Ages brought a cash-based and, in some sense, capitalist economy, and preferred to think of a transitional period, intermediate between feudalism and capitalism, with its own distinctive social relationships. And Hilton tried as hard as he could to play down the impact of the Black Death, arguing that the changes that occurred were induced by new patterns of relationship between lord and peasant, and by the increasing role of towns, which I'll be saying a lot more about. The unpredictable arrival of pestilence from far beyond the boundaries of Europe, because it originated in Inner Asia, left very uncomfortable those historians who saw the nature of social relations, and in particular the organization of labor, as the key to their understanding of the past. And in particular, it had nothing obvious to do with the class conflict that was integral to their understanding of human history. So here, non- or anti-Marxist historians, such as M. Postan of Cambridge, were able, it seems to me, to score significant points by showing that economic life was simply massively disrupted by the extreme mortality, and that what we need to do is we need to work out whether the plague brought what some historians have called an economic depression of the Renaissance, severe recession, and Postan believed that, or the restructuring of the economy in ways that opened up new opportunities for growth, as many historians, such as myself, would now prefer to insist. An extreme example of the argument in favour of a more positive economic outcome was presented by A.R. Bridbury, a historian at the LSE, who cheekily entitled one of his books Economic Growth, but it's actually about late 14th and 15th century England, where a time when, according to so many of the other historians, there was a deep depression. Where Sweezy, even allowing for the breathtaking breadth of his generalizations, had something valuable to say, was in his emphasis on the role of towns in transforming the economy of late medieval Europe. But just to take on board the demographic studies of Postan and his heirs, the significance of the Black Death lies in significant measure not just in the overall mortality, but in the effect that the plague had on the cities. In 1347 to 50, the cities were hit especially hard. The concentration of population within the confined, unhygienic space of a walled city facilitated the spread of the most virulent form of the plague, pneumonic plague. Artisan workshops were wiped out. Skilled professionals, physicians who looked after the sick, notaries who wrote the wills of the sick, suffered terribly. Rural villages were deserted as well as the workforce became too small to till the land. And survivors gravitated towards the cities where job opportunities beckoned and where the bonds of serfdom would no longer oblige them to work for a demanding lord. The famous phrase, Stadtluft macht frei, city air makes free. Under the impact of this migration, urban population recovered remarkably quickly in places such as Hamburg and Bremen. And the result was that the ratio between urban and rural population across Europe shifted significantly in favour of the towns. The switch from overpopulation before the Black Death to underpopulation, in effect, meant that wages, which had long been depressed, rose very significantly in town and country. And a smaller population placed much less strain on the productive capacities of the countryside, which had been pushed up to and beyond their limits in the half-century before the Black Death, which had been a time of frequent famines because of this. I mean, whether we describe it as Malthusian is an open question, but because of this overpopulation, particularly in Northern Europe. And meanwhile, many of the survivors of the plague had inherited money and property from dead relatives, and they found themselves rising up the economic ladder. They wanted to get up the social ladder as well. I'll come back to that in a minute. So in these circumstances, diet improved, which of course also increased resistance to later onslaughts of the plague. Urban crafts revived as demand for good quality products expanded. And this is particularly noticeable in the major medieval industry, the cloth industry. Better materials and richer colours became more widespread. The cultivation of woad, which was Europe's substitute for the indigo of the East, that flourished in the area around Toulouse. Madder was produced in the Netherlands, and so on. In other words, the interaction between town and country intensified. Industrial crops were produced more and more widely in the vicinity of major towns or traded across considerable distances. The standard of living improved significantly for the survivors during the period from about 1350 to 1500. Much greater variety was injected into the economy as regional specialization took off at last on a significant scale. So it can be seen that the assessment of Bridbury and his allies, Bridbury of economic growth, concerning the renewal and even strengthening of the Western European economy at this period has many attractions. This isn't to deny that there were acute tensions within the cities, where urban uprisings often involved the immigrants and their descendants, who might not have access to the guilds that attempted, often unsuccessfully, to control membership of the workforce. But what these uprisings in Northern and Southern Europe reveal is precisely that the economy was being radically restructured, and that various types of worker who would have been excluded from influence in older and simpler times were now key workers whose political voice was occasionally expressed through violence. This overview of economic developments in the late 14th and 15th century seems to me essential if one is to understand the role of trade and banking in the late medieval and Renaissance economy. The transformations we shall be observing took place within a very particular context in which a sudden catastrophe, the Black Death, created a new set of economic relationships. But to understand the impact on trade, we also need, and the economy as a whole, we need to step a little further back in time with an eye particularly on the Mediterranean. Now, as distinguished historians such as Jacques Le Goff have emphasized, the medieval attitude to money was full of ambiguities. Popes and kings in medieval Europe combined public distaste for the money business with keen involvement in it. The core issue by the 12th century in Western Europe became the charging of interest on loans, and ecclesiastical condemnation of the charging of interest was accentuated in the 13th century when close reading of texts by Aristotle made public the argument that money an inanimate thing cannot grow like a plant. To make it appear to do so was contrary to nature, indeed immoral. And this view was widely expressed in 13th century Spain, where the former head of the Dominican order, Ramón de Peñafort, discussed Aristotle's views and the possible distinction, which not everybody made, between usura, usury, and interesse, interest. Usura was exploitative. The aim of the usurer was to make such a profit that he could live, often bounteously, from his money lending, which impoverished the lender. So he's seen as basically unproductive, no allowance being made for the fact that some people, peasants in particular, might actually need a loan to tide themselves over critical times of the year, for instance, on the eve of the harvest. Peñafort, however, was more thoughtful about interesse. Literally, interesse means that which lies in between. Interesse, between is. And here he was thinking of the service charge that could reasonably be charged for going to the trouble of lending to one's neighbour. And some attempt to enact this was made in the late 14th, 15th century in Italy with the foundation of the Franciscan pawn shops, or pawn shops set up by city governments, which one of them still survives. The famous Italian bank, the Monte dei Paschi di Siena, founded in 1472, originated as one of these local pawn shops. Nonetheless, merchants made loans in order to carry on business, and interest was charged at rates beyond what Peñafort would have accepted. And Jacques Le Goff linked this outlook to the rise of a merchant class in interesting, I should say very controversial ways. But let me set out his views. He noted the simultaneous rise of doctrines of salvation that offered hope to those guilty of venial sins such as usury. He argued that the previously rather vague doctrine of purgatory attracted support in the Central Middle Ages because it provided a let-out clause to moneylenders and other businessmen. In the next world, there's a middle realm between heaven and hell for the middle classes, a place where they can be purged of their sins before ascending to divine bliss. The choice was no longer between shooting upstairs into heaven or dropping straight down into hellfire. This isn't to say that purgatory was a comfortable place. It wasn't a sort of open prison where people were sort of, cosseted a little bit. But time among its tortures was limited. And with the help of those still on earth, it could be limited still further by gifts to the church, often of money. And if given in a sincere spirit, this had the power to reduce the amount of time a departed soul would, or who might be a close relative, close friend or something, would spend in purgatory. So we see coming together time and money. Right, time in purgatory, money to reduce the time in purgatory. And time and money are the very features that characterize a usurious transaction. But here they've been put to good use in the service of the church. Well, this concern about usury wasn't unique to the Catholic Church. It was common to the three Abrahamic religions around the Mediterranean. Christian prohibitions were rooted in passages in the Hebrew Bible, and Muslim opposition to interest has lasted to this day. Nor was it the case that Jewish law permitted money lending, quite the contrary, but loopholes could always be found everywhere. In Northern Europe, it's true, Jews who were denied access to crafts were in effect forced into money lending. And some Christian rulers, for instance in France, found this convenient since they were reluctant to admit that their fellow Christians were also involved in usury. In the Catholic Mediterranean, where most crafts and professions were open to Jews, Jews were by and large no more involved in money lending than Christians. Everyone with spare cash kept it on the move. If you had a sort of legacy from a dead aunt or something that suddenly came to you, you went and invested it. So everybody kept it on the move in a commercial economy which began to take hold from the 12th century onwards. Now, among Christians, mechanisms developed to avoid the accusation of charging interest. One of the most important and useful mechanisms was the fixing of exchange rates to incorporate hidden interest. What you could do was you could take money in one currency, but repay it in another. And even when a charge had obviously been levied, this was in some opinions acceptable because it was, once again, it was just a service charge. So it's not really surprising that as early as the 12th century, contracts, commercial contracts in Genoa, for instance, often referred to the proficuum quod Deus dederit, the profit that God shall give. And more striking is the phrase, in the name of God and profit, which appears on page after page of the account books of a particularly famous Tuscan merchant from around 1400, Francesco di Marco d'Attini, the famous merchant of Prato. And of course the church, which condemned usury, was not untouched by interest payments. With the rise of the great Italian banks in Florence and elsewhere during the late 13th century, popes and kings came to rely heavily on financial advances from exceptionally wealthy Christian bankers. Now, admittedly, rulers who were thought to be in good credit were often given interest-free loans. Well, in the case of the rulers of England and southern Italy, Kingdom of Naples, there was an opportunity to acquire special privileges from those rulers, free or partially free of taxes, usually for the export of vital commodities, such as wool in the case of England, which the Italian bankers wanted, or wheat in the case of southern Italy. And such privileges were more valuable than interest payments, though recovering the initial loan, as we shall see, could be troublesome. Now, as Dante was well aware, all this contact with Florentine and other moneylenders tarnished the reputation of big-spending popes and cardinals. But the bankers knew that their position was precarious, and this applied whether they were Jews or Lombards, which was the generic term for the Italian bankers, or also the third group, the Knights Templar, who were also active in banking in the 13th century, despite following a monastic rule and enjoying the direct protection of the Pope. At the start of the 14th century, King Philip IV of France expelled the Jews and the Lombards and suppressed the Order of the Temple. And even if his declared reason for hounding out the Jews and the Templars was religious, there's no real doubt that his motives were financial. Well, there's always the difficulty here in establishing where the working capital of the bankers came from. And this is especially true in the case of Florence, which had been something of a backwater in the early 13th century, but rose to great prominence as a centre of both banking and of the cloth industry by 1300. By the middle of the 13th century, Florentine businessmen, often trading under the flag of convenience of Pisa, their wealthier neighbour, were present in the Holy Land, in the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem, and in its flourishing commercial capital, Acre. Around 1252, they were also, is this going to work? Hold on. I need the next picture. Oh, not working, not doing anything. Sorry? No. Oh. Can anybody call up the next picture? It doesn't seem to be. Maybe it's just not on. Oh, very good. Excellent. You mean it was, yeah. Right. In the around 1252, the Florentines were present in Tunis, again as honorary Pisans, but they made quite a stir at the court of the local Muslim ruler when he saw them flashing around in their hands these gold coins, the florin, which with the genuine of Genoa, was the first gold coinage to be minted in the West, north of southern Italy and parts of Spain since the time of Charlemagne, so since about 800. And the minting of the florin from 1252 onwards was soon copied by other cities, such as Venice. Actually, no, Venice came in much later, but then all sorts of people began to imitate the minting of the florin. And it testifies to the accumulation of profits from lands rich in gold, such as the cities of North Africa and the Levant, areas that were also poor in silver and attempted to draw Western silver towards themselves. So we have this sort of silver going in one direction, gold coming in the other direction. The money market, therefore, provided an important bond between Christian Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. And we're still left with a mystery why a second-ranked city, Florence, was able to take the lead in this monetary revolution. But of course, it did not remain a second-ranked city for much longer. The Florentine network of trade provided a platform for the expansion of banking. And here we can observe the role of great ancient families, patricians such as the Bardi and the Peruzzi, who established the two greatest banks in the history of medieval Europe, far outstripping in their operations the Medici of the 15th century, who are much more famous, of course. And in conjunction with a third bank, the Acciaiuoli, the Bardi and Peruzzi, dominated the economic life of southern Italy, the Kingdom of Naples, which at the end of the 13th and during the 14th century lay under the rule of a French dynasty, the House of Anjou, and was a tremendously important source of food for them. These banks owed their success to an alliance between Florence, the kings of Naples, and the papacy, the so-called Guelph alliance, whose symbol was the lily of France, which remains the symbol of Florence to this day. You look at the buses in Florence and you'll see that on the side of them. However, as we shall see, the bankers eventually gained the confidence to make their own political decisions, which were not necessarily very wise ones. The kings of Naples allowed them to export prodigious amounts of wheat and other primary foodstuffs in order to feed their home city, which, according to a 14th century source that we have, could only feed itself from its own resources for 5 months out of 12. So it depended very heavily on these external supplies. And as Florence became a more and more important centre of trade, industry and finance, the city attracted a flow of migrants from the Tuscan countryside and far beyond, which placed a further strain on the food supply. But the activities of the Bardi, Peruzzi and Acciaiuoli also remind us how we have to be very careful about describing these institutions merely as banks. Loans were an important part of their business, but they were family-based companies with very wide interests. They were as capable of organising grand shipments of wheat from southern Italy or wool from England as they were of making loans and of calculating interest. And another very important characteristic of these so-called banks is that they were short-term associations entered into mainly among members of the family itself and dissolved after a period of a few years. They could be renewed, and they often were, but the partners would very often change. These partners operated through agents, some of them family members, others trusted employees, who were placed as their representatives in the towns where they conducted most of their business. So places like the island of Rhodes, Naples, Palermo, Avignon, just to mention the Mediterranean places. But business in Northern Europe provided a second prop to these companies, and their activities there were closely intertwined with their business in the Mediterranean. England was a prime source of very high-quality wool for Florentine looms, which the Bardi, Peruzzi and other Florentine companies exported by arrangement with the English kings to Flanders or directly to Italy on ships. And here's a nice picture of a medieval ship, the sort of ship that went round the Mediterranean, actually, rather than the sort of ship they would have used to get from England to the Mediterranean. But anyway, by 1281, the Italians were exporting English wool from England all the way through the Straits of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean. Woolen cloth from Flanders, as well as raw wool converted into cloth in Tuscany, particularly in Florence, was exported in vast quantities across the Mediterranean. So much so that economic historians have talked of the dumping of Western textiles in the Near East in places such as Alexandria and Damascus in the late Middle Ages. And they've linked this particularly to a process of industrial decline in the Islamic world after about 1200. Now, this dumping eased, but it did not solve the balance of payments problem between East and West, which arose from the export from the East of luxury goods and costly spices and the import of raw materials, textiles and foodstuffs from the West. The balance of payments basically favoured the East all the way through the period we're looking at. Anyway, operating in England was not always easy, and the bankers became sucked into the very fraught political rivalries of the country under King Edward II, and then the real difficulty arose under King Edward III when they overextended themselves, hoping to recover loans made to the king and his court following what turned out to be a disastrous military campaign in Flanders. Risk assessment was, for better or worse, not part of the vocabulary or methods of 14th century bankers. And the early 1340s also saw overextension in the Kingdom of Naples, and the difficulties that the Bardi, Peruzzi and Acciaiuoli were facing in the two key territories of their business empire led to a banking crash that shook the economic foundations not just of Florence, but of all the monarchies that had relied upon the Florentines. Well, the three banks were not obliterated. They continued afterwards, but their operations were more muted. And the banks of late 14th and 15th century Florence and the other Italian cities were much smaller operations, like the Medici, working with less capital and smaller staff, though they continued to be these short-term renewable associations for, say, 5 years. The Medici, despite this more modest manner of operating, still had agents across Europe and the Mediterranean. They were noticeable above all in Bruges, the great financial and trading centre of Flanders. I'll return to Bruges a bit later. The post-Black Death period saw other changes in the way business was conducted, the effects of which are still with us. We find increasing use of double-entry bookkeeping, which enabled better control over profit and loss. We see more and more sophisticated use of gyro bank transfers in Venice in particular, to which it was not always convenient to bring large quantities of bullion. Obviously, there were risks involved in carrying it across open territory. And this speaks to, the gyro bank transfers speak for networks of trust, based sometimes on family ties, but increasingly on other forms of familiarity, which might exclude face-to-face knowledge of one's business partner, who might be hundreds of miles away. Exact record keeping, guaranteed by legislation, was vitally important. A very noticeable change, it seems to me, is the spread of insurance, which had been something of a rarity around 1200, but by the middle of the 15th century, there was big business to be made by insuring shipments out of cities such as Barcelona. For this was a region where piracy had become a serious problem. One thinks particularly of the attacks of the Barbary corsairs, which were increasing in this period. Now, whether the slowly increasing use of Arabic numerals was a help is another question. Oddly, to our way of thinking, Arabic numerals tended to be used rather as we use Roman ones to number lists, for instance. Complex formulae and the use of the abacus made it possible to multiply and divide using Roman numerals. And yet the introduction of Arabic numerals into Western Europe went back to around 1200, when Leonardo Fibonacci, a Pisan who had long experience of Bougie in Algeria and of Tunis, had written a tract on the subject. And in the late 15th century, arithmetical manuals, Luca Pacioli, famous one from 1494, an even early one printed at Treviso near Venice in 1478, all this enhanced the ability of merchants to conduct business accurately. Well, if one wants to identify a particular area of economic activity in the post-plague era that demonstrates how Western European merchants invested in products grown far away and then transmitted them to scattered markets across Europe, one could seize on the example of sugar. This product, which is native to the East Indies, percolated into the Islamic world in the early Middle Ages, was cultivated in Syria and parts of southern Spain, and in Sicily up to the early 13th century. After the Black Death, the Genoese operated highly successful sugar mills in the Cypriot panhandle, the bit of Cyprus that sort of sticks out towards Turkey. Demand for sugar boomed in the post-plague era, along with demand for luxury goods as a whole, as I've said. And the interest of sugar lies not just in the fact that it was an upmarket product that could not be produced in lands north of the Mediterranean, but in the fact that it was a labour-intensive product and that the conditions required for its manufacture were quite specific, in particular a plentiful water supply. By 1400, the Genoese were investing in sugar mills, trappetti as they call them, in Sicily, where the intensive cultivation of sugar stocks was revived after an interval of about 150 years. Now, often these investors were Genoese settlers on the island, working in partnership with local businessmen. And their business methods would be, as we shall see, reproduced again and again, also once the Atlantic began to be opened up. The ownership of sugar mills could actually lie very far from the place of production. In the late 15th century, a German trading outfit called the Grosse Ravensburger Handelsgesellschaft, the Great Ravensburg Trading Company, decided to rationalize its interest in the sugar industry by not just dealing in the product, but also acquiring a sugar mill in Valencia, the northernmost area where sugar could be produced. And in the 1460s, they also hired Moorish labor to work the sugar mills. The operation wasn't a success. It only lasted a decade or two. But still, it was a very interesting experiment in investing in sugar all the way from the planting of the stocks to the marketing of these very elaborate confections that they would hope to sell to the Dukes of Burgundy, the burghers of Nuremberg and Regensburg, and so on. And standing further back from the actual production of this commodity, the Florentines, Genoese and Catalans also built very close commercial ties to producers in the one remaining Muslim kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula, the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada, where they obtained silk. This is a piece of silk in the Victoria and Albert Museum from the Kingdom of Granada, sort of thing these merchants were very keen to get hold of. And they also obtained fine glazed ceramics. A Portuguese ship portrayed on a piece of pottery from the Kingdom of Granada, again in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and dried fruits. And without the financial support of the Italian and Catalan businessmen, I doubt whether the kings of Granada would have had the means to build their astonishing palaces on the Alhambra hill, or to keep their little kingdom alive, as they did till 1492, in the face of repeated pressure from the inhabitants of Castile. The relevance of sugar to any account of the European economy at the end of the Middle Ages can be demonstrated in other ways too. In response to Turkish advances in the eastern Mediterranean, Western European merchants began to search for less dangerous markets in which to obtain not just sugar, but other generically Eastern products, such as the dried fruits that they obtained in very large quantities from Valencia and Granada instead of Turkey and Greece. When it came to sugar, however, the shift away from the Turkish and other Muslim lands took European merchants not just to Sicily and Valencia, but through the Straits of Gibraltar to the newly discovered Atlantic islands, which had fallen in the early 15th century under the dominion of the previously rather insignificant Kingdom of Portugal. As I say, this is a Portuguese ship, and more specifically under the control of Prince Henry, known as the Navigator. Henry and his successors transformed Madeira, a previously uninhabited island on the edge of the horizon, into a phenomenally successful centre of sugar production, able to supply not just Portugal and Spain, but Flanders and Northern Europe with quite astonishing quantities of sugar. The island had all the advantages of good water supplies, rich virgin soil, and so on. And so even more than Muslim Granada, Portugal was propped up by these sort of sugar mountains. At the end of the 15th century, though, the decision to shift production to São Tomé, an island on the equator in the sort of bend of Africa, proved that bad mistakes could be made. The humid climate rendered the drying process ineffective, very important to dry out these lumps of sugar. And the local insect population took up residence in the blocks of sugar. So when they arrived in Europe, you cracked these lumps open, you found lots of creepy crawlies in them. This was not very much appreciated. A return to very high quality production really only occurs in the mid-16th century when Brazil is opened up as a centre of sugar production. They do actually produce high quality sugar there. Well, this gives some sense of the geographical spread of sugar, but in the context of a lecture on capitalism, there are two aspects that need to be stressed. And one is the continuing presence of Genoese investors. Here's an image of Genoa from the Nuremberg Chronicle from the 1490s, in fact, very remarkable sort of world history that has pictures of all these towns. The Genoese saw good business opportunities, not just in Madeira, the Azores, Cape Verde, these islands in the Atlantic, but also in the Canary Islands, which were not part of the Portuguese domain, but had fallen under Spanish rule. But the conquest of the Canaries was achieved very slowly. Tenerife, whose Guanche population, the native population, resisted stoutly despite its Stone Age weapons, only fell to the King of Castile in 1496. But it's striking that as each of these islands fell to the Spaniards, Genoese investors moved in within months to set up sugar mills to service small colonies of settlers from Spain, Portugal, and Italy. And it comes as no surprise to find that a similar pattern can be detected in the Caribbean following the discovery of the Caribbean islands by Christopher Columbus, who was, though some people insist on proclaiming otherwise, he was most definitely a Genoese, and he had past experience of the Madeira sugar industry. And the fascination of these endeavours is that we're looking at pioneers who mobilised European capital to create new commercial networks built upon new centres of production of a highly profitable luxury article. The other aspect of the sugar industry that should be stressed is the organisation of labour. By and large, sugar production within Iberia did not depend on gangs of slaves. The work was backbreaking, but the best way to do the worst of it was to hitch a donkey to the sugar press and send it around in circles all day. Domestic slavery was quite widespread in the Christian cities of the Mediterranean in this period, contrary to what most people imagine, cities such as Palermo and Genoa. But the large-scale use of slave labour was rare. And this was also the case in the Canaries, where although large numbers of the native population were enslaved, they were carried off to Seville and other Spanish cities, and they were put to work in as domestic labour. So they do the gardening or whatever in a palace, that sort of thing. And as far as one can see, much of the physical labour in the sugar mills in the 15th century was performed by free Portuguese migrants who were common not just in the Portuguese colonies, but also in the Spanish ones, Tenerife and Gran Canaria. The exception, this is a sad story, is São Tomé, where in an act of unprecedented brutality, the King of Portugal in the 1490s dispatched hundreds of Jewish children to the island where they were to be brought up as Christians as far as possible from their parents and were set to work in the sugar plantations, I presume as slaves. And not surprisingly, it doesn't seem any of them survived jungle conditions for very long. In the Caribbean, where Columbus and his successors treated the native Indians as in effect slaves, though legally they were free, it was only much later that sugar plantations began to succeed. These early attempts to introduce sugar in the Caribbean didn't really take off. And by the time that the sugar plantations were beginning to produce reasonable quantities of sugar, the native population, the Taino Indians, had all died out, and black African labour began to be imported in larger and larger numbers, the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. And this slow start reflected the reluctance of the Genoese and others to invest in a far-off land which was already torn apart by Spanish misgovernment and internal rivalries. Well, Genoa during the 16th century would make a fortune out of America after all, not through the sugar of the Caribbean, but by anticipating the arrival of the silver galleons, which came bringing silver from Peru, which had been mined in Peru, and tiding over the high-spending Spanish rulers alongside German bankers, of whom the Fuggers of Augsburg are the most famous. So the success of 16th century Genoa was based not on its traditional trading networks, which had fallen apart or were falling apart, but on the ability of the Genoese elite to keep the Spanish monarchy afloat financially. And Genoa was not alone among the great commercial centres of the late Middle Ages in shifting towards the provision of financial services. Bruges lost its importance as a centre of trade, as its outport silted up, and as the Flemish cloth industry faced stronger competition from England and elsewhere. But it grew in importance as a centre for the transfer of bills, settlement of debts and so on. It benefited from the presence on its streets of consulates of the Genoese, Florentine and Hanseatic business communities whose houses can still be visited in the city. This is the Genoese one. The fact that the beautiful building of the Genoese consulate is now the Belgian National Potato Chip Museum is, I suppose, neither here nor there. You see, it says Friet Museum, which means chip museum. Means you can go inside, anyway. In Barcelona, merchant families had already been switching from active investment in trade to investment in bonds during the 15th century. And city governments in particular were anxious to issue bonds so that they could cover their ambitious building projects, whether the amplification of the port or the construction of the magnificent loggias, which proclaimed the wealth and glory of the city. These loggias are a good place to conclude. However one defines capitalism in a medieval context, it's abundantly clear that throughout Western Europe, the end of the Middle Ages saw a transformation in the relationship between town and country, with urban-based activities propped up by vigorous investment gaining a higher profile. We could say that the urban economy became dominant as never before, at least since the fall of Rome. A platform was also created for the launch of the great Atlantic business enterprises, of which sugar production was the most important, even before the rise of the evil and long-lasting transatlantic slave trade. But perhaps the best way to finish is with the remarkable moral defense of money-making that is inscribed around the walls of... Oh, goodness, sorry. I was trying to do the... Where is it? There we are. You can see there's an inscription. It actually goes all the way around. That inscription is rather lost there. The inscription that goes all the way around the walls of the late 15th century Loggia or Yoccia in Valencia. A building whose soaring Gothic architecture also proclaimed boundless confidence in the value of trade and investment. This is what it says. I am an illustrious house built in 15 years. Fellow citizens, rejoice and see how good a thing is business when it does not give rise to lies in speaking, when it keeps faith with one's neighbour and does not deceive him, when it does not dedicate money to usury. The merchant who acts in this way will prosper galore and eventually will enjoy eternal life. Thank you.